Uzbek is a language that she has been doing field work on since 2009. And it actually all started here in our summer language workshop known as SWISL, which used to be because it was Slavic and East European, but now it's much, much broader. So she learned Uzbek that year, that summer, when you were a grad student. It was at Santa Cruz. And we actually had a reading group together. It was really exciting. It was wonderful to see you progressing in that area. I'm going to read what it says in this little book here that Professor Gribanova is an Assistant Professor of Linguistics at Stanford University. Her research explores principles that connect word and sentence structure through morpho phonological structure, primarily in Slavic, Russian, and Bulgarian. I tried really hard to get a Slavic lecture out of her, but you know, time zones and everything in the way, and Uzbek, Turkic. She specializes in the study of ellipsis, in particular the interaction of syntactic movement operations, phrasal and head movement. I think you have some interesting papers on head movement. One coming out maybe in NLT, that's exciting. And elliptical structures. The work on Uzbek revolves around the range of possible clausal structures in the language, and case marking and agreement properties of these different clausal environments. I took the liberty of downloading a quite extensive CV, and I noticed a very, very big mistake, because it can tell the future. And it says here, Associate Professor as of 9/1/2018, today is 3/3. Congratulations.
I can tell the future.
There you go.
Thank you all. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to the organizers of this lovely event for making it so great. Thanks to all the speakers. I've enjoyed lots and lots of interesting talks today. So I have very fond memories of being here as a graduate student and learning Uzbek. That was a wonderful experience, and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to do that, and it sort of launched me into this long-standing interest in fieldwork on Uzbek and the syntactic analysis of this language, which at the time there was basically no generative work on at all, and that still is more or less true, although less true with every passing year, which is exciting. Do we have any Uzbek speakers in the audience? Raise your hands. Welcome. Great. Glad to have you here. So today I want to tell you about the distribution of subject, case, and agreement in a bunch of different types of clausal environments, non-finite environments in Uzbek. So we have here listed 4. Number 1 says clausal arguments. It should actually say clausal arguments of verbs. Okay. These also show up as clausal arguments of nouns. They show up as adjunct clauses, and the same strategy shows up in 2 types of relative clauses. If you know anything about Turkic syntax, you know that's like a big problem in Turkish syntax. It's also a big problem in Uzbek syntax, so we're going to be mostly putting aside relative clauses for the purposes of today's discussion, but they will come up a little bit. So I give you some examples to look at here just so you have a sense of what's going on. Looking at 1 through 3. What you see is a clause that's rendered with some nominal morphology. And the nominal part is there's genitive marking on the subject. There is a nominalizer, which in this case is lig. And there is agreement from the possessive paradigm with the subject that's marked genitive. Okay. So for the people in the audience that might not be familiar with this notation, where you see a star, that means this is ungrammatical, okay, as judged by native speakers of Uzbek. A star within parentheses means this is not grammatical with that piece there, and a star outside the parentheses means it's ungrammatical unless you say this part, okay? So just something to keep track of. So 1 is a vanilla example of what these look like, and 2 and 3 show you something interesting. The genitive and the nominative case are not in free variation on the subject, even though in 1 it sort of looks like you can have the genitive marker or not, okay? They're not in free variation. Word order in 2 and clause type in 3 are very important, okay? And we'll be talking at length about what that involves. So these clauses give us some insight, I think, into the connection between case and agreement, and also have consequences for 2 prominent and competing theories of case licensing and agreement. So what are those 2 theories? We have for a long time known that there is an interconnected set of observations, right? One set is about the distribution of nominal arguments. The next is about the morphological case marking associated with those arguments. And the third is about the agreement patterns that are triggered by those arguments. And so somehow all those things are connected, but we have yet to really understand the formal nature of that connection. And there are 2 prominent theories currently on the market. Of course, there are others, but these are the 2 we're going to be comparing. The first is called head licensing. In this approach, case is licensed by a structural relation with a syntactic head. These syntactic heads establish a link to a noun phrase. This link is, this sort of syntactic dependency is called agree. This relation is constrained by various structural conditions, and it simultaneously values case and 5 features. Those are person, number, and gender in languages that have gender features. Okay, so that's kind of the picture sketched for you in the middle of the first page. The second theory is configurational case assignment. That's what people normally call this. In these theories, nominal case is assigned according to a disjunctive hierarchy. So you start by assigning lexical or oblique case, and then dependent case, which is accusative or ergative depending on your language, and then a marked case, and then maybe default case. Okay? And there's sort of like a mechanism. You can sort of look at the syntactic representation, and then there's some mechanism that determines how exactly the cases are going to get assigned to that syntactic representation. In head licensing, agreement and structural case licensing are reflexes of the same syntactic relation, a relation between a head and some nominal domain in its C-command domain, some nominal argument in its C-command domain. In the configurational approach, the link between case and agreement is less direct. Okay. So Turkic, broadly speaking, has already played a big role in this debate. And that's because Baker and Vinokurova wrote a paper about Saha, structures that look quite a lot like the structures I'm talking about here. They claim that you need both kinds of case assignment, actually. You need both kinds of systems to get all the patterns right. Their argument for the necessity of head licensing rests on evidence from Saha anomalized clauses. And they said that genitive subjects are licensed if and only if there's also subject agreement. So somehow there's a link there, a symmetry that's necessary. And then Preminger and Levin wrote a response saying that's not actually true. You don't need the symmetry. You just need to configure your assumptions a little bit differently, and you can get the same result using a configurational approach. So what I want to point out here is that these two proposals consist of a set of assumptions, each one of them, right? Clusters of assumptions, which are in principle independent of each other. Okay. So one question we can ask is, does structural case assignment depend on the featural identity of a licensing head, yes or no? Okay. Does case assignment care about a relation with a head or not? A second question we can ask, does agreement result from agree with the syntactic head, yes or no? We'll mostly ignore this issue because I don't think Uzbek bears on that directly. The third question is, must subject case and subject agreement always target the same nominal? So when you do agreement and subject case assignment, are you always doing, establishing the relation with the same thing in the syntax? In fact, the dichotomy between these two approaches I just described to you is kind of a false one, I think. In the sense that they may not be as different as these previous discussions make them out to be. At least that's what the Uzbek data is kind of telling me once you look at all the facts. That's what emerges from those facts. Okay, so there's like a little table there in the middle of page 2 that lists all the questions and then the answers to those questions that are given by the configurational approach, that are given by the head licensing approach, and then what I think Uzbek does. And you can see that there's a mixed pattern, right? In some cases, for some patterns, it looks like the configurational approach does better. For some other patterns, it looks like the head licensing approach does better. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. The first claim I'm going to make is that featural specifications of heads do matter for the assignment of unmarked case, in this case, genitive case. So that is an inherent part of the head licensing approach. It has that covered. In the configurational approach, it's already sort of been said that the category of a head can matter. But what I'm gonna go a step further here and say that actually it goes beyond category. Like the featural identity of the head, not just its category, matter for case assignment. And then the second point I want to make toward the latter part of the talk has to do with evidence from non-finite copular clauses in this language. What I'm going to try to show is that even if agreement features and case features are hosted on the same head, they can target different nominals. Okay. So that bears on question 3, whether the relation always has to be with the same thing. Okay, and that, if I'm right about that, then it of course follows directly from the view that's often associated with the configurational approach, which is that agreement and case don't have to be symmetric relations, and it contradicts head licensing, in which case assignment and 5-feature evaluation have to both take place by agree with a single nominal. Okay. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to tell you some basics about the fieldwork and the structure of Uzbek and so on. Then we're going to talk at length about the distribution of genitive case and agreement in argument versus adjunct clauses, because that's the kind of empirical meat of the talk. And then we're going to talk about these two areas of convergence that I mentioned earlier and really flesh them out. So some background about this language. It, last I checked, had about 18.8 million speakers, but I checked actually a while ago, so the number could have changed. Most of them live in Uzbekistan. It's, of course, head final and agglutinating, like a good Turkic language should be. Now, all of the data here is drawn from fieldwork with consultants. So everything you see here has been run by at least 2 or 3 people, sometimes more, in cases where I wasn't getting really categorical responses. I work with speakers in Uzbekistan, in Moscow, in New York, and in the Bay Area in California. And some of what I do has a documentation component. So for this talk, not as much, but there are some patterns where I just collected systematic surveys, especially in cases where it seemed like there was gradients or maybe variation. And those are online, in fact, at the Stanford Digital Repository. So if you're interested in kind of poking around with data, raw data, you can go look there. So this audience does not really need the map at the bottom of page 2. Everybody knows where Uzbekistan is. But it is still, I think, serving a useful purpose. It's a reminder that there is regional and other kind of microvariation here. And that microvariation is not purely phonological or lexical. Like, those are the two things people will tell you right away that seem fairly obvious about variance of Uzbek. But actually what I'm finding, and I mean, this is not as well known, what I'm finding is that there's quite a bit of syntactic variation as well, in particular with the use of the genitive marker, okay? And that variation seems regional in part. So if you're closer to Kyrgyzstan or closer to Kazakhstan or closer to Turkmenistan, you might be doing different things with that genitive marker. And it's also connected, I think, to age. So we're seeing some language change in progress with respect to the use of the genitive, in particular with respect to it basically dropping out of the language. So if you look at like Baker and Vinokurova's work on CeLCAR, you'll see that that's like the end stage almost of that process. So you really don't see genitives there a lot at all, except in like very, very specific configurations. So Uzbek might be heading in that direction slowly, because younger speakers are doing something different from older speakers in this respect. So I won't be talking much about that here. Feel free to ask me about it in the question period. Mostly here, we're going to be looking at the use of Ning and trying to make systematic generalizations about it, in fact, sort of factoring out whatever variation there is. I'll mention it when I think it's relevant. So looking now at the case system, this is a pretty well-behaved accusative, nominative accusative language. Okay, that was going to happen eventually. Okay, so special things to observe. The genitive appears optional, but of course I'm going to be arguing it's not. It's structurally conditioned. But more importantly, in conversational speech, you hear n a lot, so it's reduced. And n sounds like the accusative. So that's inconvenient because it's in fact hard to tell whether that's really, like, is that being reanalyzed as an accusative? On objects, accusative sometimes appears and sometimes not, because this is a differential object marking language, so that's also structurally conditioned. And then there are inherent cases, or sometimes people want to analyze them as postpositions, and those are dative, locative, and ablative. Okay, so the canonical syntactic context for the use of the genitive involves possessive constructions, right? So my book. The possessor bears genitive, and the possessed argument bears possessor agreement, okay? That's the paradigm you see in 5. So mening tobim. Please excuse my pronunciation. I have terrible ears, so you'll have to bear with me. The paradigm you see in 5 is co-opted for use in nonfinite constructions. The subject bears genitive or nominative, and the subject agreement marker is drawn from the paradigm you see in 5. So if you're just in like a normal finite matrix clause of Uzbek, you're not going to be using the agreement markers we see here. You're going to be using different agreement markers. So that's what we see in 6. We're going to focus mostly on clauses of the form in 6. I'm not going to list like all the patterns for every other type of clause necessarily, but you can safely assume, unless I say otherwise, that the same patterns hold in other clause types as well. Okay, so What's going on in 6 is that we have a matrix subject man, which is there to help you understand what's going on, but in fact it's a pro-drop language, so you wouldn't normally see that there. The matrix subject, and then at the very end, the matrix verb bilaman, and it's an SOV language, so the object is the second thing in the clause, and the object happens to be complex. In this case, it is a clause, right? It's a clause of a particular type with this genitive marking and the possessive subject agreement. It's got a nominalizer, lig, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And the last piece of morphology in that clause is ne, which is an accusative marker. Where does the accusative marker come from? It's actually the whole clause being accusative marked by the verb. And if it were a different verb, like a verb that marked its complement's dative, then you'd see the dative there. Okay. So there's a little wrinkle, which is that ning is used primarily in written registers, okay, or in formal registers. But speakers do have intuitions about the use of ning. And when they were presented with these sentences, they heard ning from me. Okay, the other thing I want you to know about a little bit, it's sort of in the background as we're going to go through these discussions, but this is a differential argument marking language. Okay, so the object patterns are fairly well known across Turkic, and the subject patterns less so. Okay, so the differential object marking is what you see like in 7, okay, and 8 and 9 just show the more or less familiar Pan-Turkic differential object marking pattern, where accusative marked objects can occupy a higher structural position than non-accusative marked objects. Okay, so if you don't have an accusative marker, you have to show up right next to the verb. If you're accusative marked, you can actually show up higher in the structure, like higher than indirect objects. For our purposes, we're going to be interested in this, like the subject analog of that, right? So genitive is a kind of differential subject marker. The interpretive effect is something like specificity, but it seems more bleached than what's reported for other Turkic languages by Jacqueline Kornfeld. But it seems relevant, so 10A and 10B are meant to give you a sense of that. So the difference between I saw a woman reading a book and I saw the woman reading a book might be something like the difference between having a genitive on ayol or not having it there, right? And if you have a context like 11A, a man and a woman walked in, then 11B is a good follow-up, where the genitive is strongly preferred, if not obligatory. Okay, so if they've been mentioned in previous discourse, we're going to use, and we mention them again in the context where they might get a genitive, we're going to use a genitive. So there are some parallels between the DOM effect and the differential subject marking effect, and that is that accusative objects and genitive subjects are higher in the clause than their bare counterparts. Now, for accusative objects, I've just shown you that holds on page 3. But for genitive subjects, that's actually something I have to defend, so we're going to do that next. Okay. So let's look at subject positions in non-finite clauses a little bit more closely. These types of clauses have a wide range, right? So they might be complements of verbs, arguments of nouns projected in what I think is a specifier position. Sentential subjects are relative clauses. And I'm going to be showing you here 2 kinds of nominalizing strategies with lig and with ish. And we're going to mostly use lig throughout, but I want to show you the 2 different kinds so you just have a point of reference, okay? So 12 involves a clause nominalized by lig, a complement of a verb, and a thing that's kind of part of a complex noun, okay? And 13 involves something similar, but it's not using lig, it's using ish or sh as the nominalizing morpheme. So what do the grammars have to say about these morphemes? Like what are they doing? Okay, so ish usually is called something like a nominal infinitive of verbs, whatever that means, okay? And lig is explicitly discussed as a nominalizer, and by the way, it's systematically optional wherever it appears. And gan is the past participle that you see in lig clauses, and it makes verbs into participles so that they can be part of this kind of non-finite structure. Ish is uncomplimentary distribution with gan and lig. So gan and lig go together, but if you have lig, you will not have ish. Okay? They seem to be occupying one slot. And the difference between them might be something like factive versus non-factive, but I think that's an area worth exploring further. For our purposes, what's important is that both of these things are making nominalized clauses of some kind. But ish clauses are even more reduced in their ability to host various kinds of morphology than lig clauses are. So if you look at 14 versus 15, what's prohibited in lig clauses is a subset of what's prohibited in ish clauses. Very, very strikingly, the ish clauses can't even host negation. Okay, and since negation comes right after the verbal stem, I take it to be fairly low in the syntactic structure, but even negation is not included. Okay. So I'm going to take it that ish clauses are structurally smaller than lig clauses, as Asarina does for Uyghur. And these two kinds of nominalized structures can be given the structural analysis that you see in 17 and 18, which is to be revised. Okay, this is not going to be where we land, but it'll do for now. So the difference between 17 and 18 is how large the complement of the little n is. Okay, the little n is what's hosting the nominalizing morphology. The d is hosting the possessive agreement that we see. And the complement of lig is something large, like maybe an asp p, which includes crucially negation. But the complement of the little n that is ish is just a smaller little vp. Follow lots of prominent analyses of analogous Turkic structures and saying that the subject agreement is hosted in D, and that D is probably also responsible for some of the case on the subject. I'm going to take ish and lig to be realizations of little n. They're the nominalizing things. And I've already said the next point. Okay, so the main claim I want to pursue here is that the distribution of the subject inside nominalized clauses is non-random. Okay. There's a height difference between genitive and nominative subjects. The genitives are higher and the nominatives are lower. So I'm going to give you a couple of arguments in favor of that point. Genitive marking on subjects of nominalized clauses looks optional. In fact, for a long time I thought it was optional. But then I ran into the pattern you see in 19 and I was shocked and wanted to know more. And that's how I got into this project, actually. So when you scramble an argument across the subject, you can no longer mark the subject genitive. You can only mark it nominative. Okay? So if I have 19a, men buktobne Hasan okuganligini bilaman, that's fine. But I can't add ning onto Hasan. That's no longer licensed. It actually turns out that only scrambled arguments in particular disrupt the genitive assignment. So genitive on subjects continues to be available if the thing at the left edge is a modifier, like in 21, so for the test or Sunday or whatever, but not if it's an argument. So that's what you see in 22. Yeah. If a non-subject argument is scrambled to the nominalized clause edge, then the genitive is not licensed on subjects, and agreement has to target either a genitive or a nominative subject. It doesn't seem to care. Okay. So some initial structural consequences that we can take away from this. The case marking possibilities for the subject correspond to a difference in structural height. Low subjects are assigned nominative and raised subjects are assigned genitive. Subjects compete with other arguments for that high position, and that's what results in either a left peripheral genitive subject or something else being left peripheral, and then the subject is lower and gets nominative. The size of the nominalized domain, that is whether you're an ish clause or a lig clause, doesn't seem to matter because the landing site for the raising is the DP shell, which is always there, no matter how small or large the actual nominalized clause is. Okay. I am basically making the assumption here that the relation is a movement relation. And I'm going to continue making that assumption. I've convinced myself that that's true, and you can see the evidence in Appendix B if you're interested. Okay. So 23 through 26 just show you what I have in mind for cases where the subject raises and is marked genitive versus cases in which some other argument moves and the subject stays low and is marked nominative. Okay. The second piece of evidence comes from NPI licensing of genitive subjects. In 27, you see just like a vanilla finite, simple finite clause. Okay, and all that shows you is that NPIs need clause-mate negation in order to be licensed. You can't have an NPI unless you have clause-mate negation. And this is not just a co-occurrence requirement. The NPI actually has to be in the scope of negation. Now, 27 doesn't show you that, but the nominalized clause versions of 27 will show us that. So because negation immediately follows the verb stem, I take it to be the lowest thing in the extended projection after the VP. In nominalized clauses, negation is going to be by hypothesis between the low position of the subject inside VP and the high position of the subject inside DP. Okay. So if you look at 28, you'll see that neg is kind of sandwiched between the two positions that we're interested in. What it predicts is that only nominative NPI subjects should be licensed by the copresence of negation. Okay? Because only nominative NPI subjects would be in the scope of negation. Only those are C-commanded by negation. Whereas genitive NPI subjects should not be acceptable even in the presence of negation. Okay? Now, all of this rests on the assumption that the NPIs don't reconstruct, and the footnote tries to show you that that's true. Okay, and this prediction is in fact borne out. So if I make my subject an NPI, and then it's Hitchkim, it's totally fine as an NPI with clause-mate negation, but only if it's a nominative, not if it's a genitive. Okay. So if spec DP is the landing site for subjects which get genitive and other scrambled arguments, then we expect to see the same thing for scrambled arguments, right? Scrambled NPIs. The subject should remain low in that case because things are scrambling over it to compete for that high position. It should bear nominative, and it should be licensed as an NPI. Okay, and that's what you see in 30. So we get things like bu kitobni hech kim o'qimaganligini bilaman. That's good. Okay. So what that tells us, I think, is that there are two positions for subjects inside nominalized clauses. The genitive one's higher, the nominative one is lower. And finally, I want to show you that the movement is clause internal. Okay. So the subject that's raising is not raising out of the embedded clause, out of the nominalized clause. And that's important because, for example, Baker and Vinokurova have argued that that's exactly what happens. It's raising to object in languages like Saha. So next door, that might be true, but in this language, it is not yet true. I think there's maybe language change going on that front. Okay, but we know that this is the case for two reasons. One, neither the subject of the nominalized clause nor scrambled arguments can appear to the left of matrix subject, so they can't be above the subject in the higher clause. It's 31 and 32. Those are all ungrammatical. And the second argument comes from the observation that neither subjects of the nominalized clause nor scrambled arguments may appear to the left of matrix adverbs. Okay, so this is a little trickier. If you have an embedded verb in the nonfinite clause and you put gan on it, that thing has like some kind of a spectral reading that puts you in the, it's a perfect or something. So it's not going to be compatible with a temporal adverb like ertaga, tomorrow, right? So if you put ertaga at the left edge, you're only going to get the matrix interpretation for ertaga. And that's true when the subject is initial in the nominalized clause, like in 33a, and when a scrambled argument is initial as well, like in 33b. So in 33, for example, we only get, you will know tomorrow that Hassan has read this book, not the pragmatically strange thing. You know that tomorrow Hassan has read this book. If a subject, as in 34a or other argument of the nominalized clause, as in 34b, appears to the left of this adverb, the utterance is just ungrammatical, because that puts the adverb, that makes the adverb too far embedded, and it's incompatible with the perfect. Okay. So the embedded interpretation is not available because it would involve a tense or aspect clash, and the matrix interpretation is not available because subjects and other scrambled arguments can't raise past the matrix adverb. I think that's what that's telling us. Okay, so it's all it stays within the clause. So we've learned that subjects of nominalized clauses may appear in spec VP or spec DP, and that that's going to correspond with a case difference. And agreements hosted in D and always targets the subject. It doesn't care what its marking is. Okay, now we come to adjunct clauses, which are quite different. And we're going to want a principled reason for that difference eventually. Unlike argument clauses, adjunct clauses don't license genitive case at all, ever. The agreement obligatorily persists. So you get half of the pattern. You get the agreement part, but not the case marking part. That's what you see in 35a. I should say that I'm only giving you like a couple of examples here, but I have like a whole range of examples with every imaginable kind of adjunct clause, including purpose things, for, after, because, since. Okay, and they all have the same pattern. Okay. And it is kind of not surprising that this is true. Kornfeld has also found that this is true for Turkish. So no surprises there. The question then for us is what prevents licensing of genitive and adjunct clauses. So you could imagine just like a fairly simple explanation where you say D is the thing that hosts this kind of nominal agreement, and it's also the thing that assigns this kind of nominal case, right? But if that's true, then we have no way of understanding what adjunct clauses are doing because the agreement part is there. Why isn't the case part there? One explanation might be that the clause is somehow structured differently so that you can't move to that high position. Okay, but that's not the case because as 36 shows you, it is possible to scramble other arguments to the left periphery still. So that landing site is still available. That's not the explanation. What is the explanation, I think, is if you look close, it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure this out. If you look closely, you will find that in 37A and B that lig is ungrammatical with these adjunct clauses, okay? So it's the absence of a nominalizer that corresponds to the absence of the genitive case. That can't be an accident, right? So here's what I propose in 38. Following similar proposals by Baker and by Kornfeld for related languages. The structure for the adjunct clauses looks a lot like the structures we've been talking about, except it's missing a layer. It's missing the lig layer. It's not nominalized, in other words. It's a non-finite clause, but it's not nominalized. It's not nouny. It's adjuncty, whatever that is, right? It's adverbial. So with all of this in hand, let's now talk about the first area of convergence that I think this leads us to. We've seen that the availability of genitive marking on subjects is conditioned by two things. One, the distribution of the thing inside the clause, whether it's high or low, and two, the clause type, okay? Now, I think this is attributable to differences in structural configuration, so the NP layer, the little NP layer is absent in adjunct clauses, but not in clausal arguments. The intuition is that adjunct clauses lack the nominal properties that arguments have. And those nominal properties, wherever they are the properties that are licensing genitive case, and they're also the properties that are establishing a principled link between case possibilities and clause distribution. So the upshot is that the licensing head matters for Uzbek genitive marking. And there's two ways of implementing that. One is to say the head that licenses genitive is little n, and when it's missing, you don't get genitive. That would be straightforward. The second way is a little bit less straightforward, and that is to say that the head that licenses genitive is a particular kind of D. It's the kind of D that selects for little np. And I'm going to try to show you in a minute that the second one is the right one, even though it's slightly less direct. And if that's true, then we have a consequence. The consequence is that both, whether you're a head licensing person or a configurational person, you're going to be sort of forced into saying some version of the same thing, which is that the featural makeup of D matters. So the kind of D that selects for something nouny is going to have different properties than the kind of D that selects for something adverby. Right. So let me now argue that it's not little n that's doing the case assignment. This argument draws on evidence from two types of relative clauses with different marking strategies. Both are equally nominal, so they're identical in meaning, and they're identical in their external distribution. The first strategy you see in 39, I'm calling that a bare relative clause, and that's because it's the morphologically impoverished one. So you'll notice right away there's no genitive marking and there's no possessive agreement. Okay, the second one is in 40, and that's what I call the marked relative clause, and that's because it involves more morphological marking, and lo and behold, there's a genitive there and there's a possessive agreement there. So that looks a lot like the patterns we've already seen. Okay. The bare strategy, by the way, is used for all kinds of relativization. The marked one is used for non-subject relativization. There's more to say about that, but we won't worry about it here. So what's important for us is that agreement and genitive go together. There is no option with subject agreement but not case, or with case but not subject agreement. Okay? There's no intermediate possibility where you just have one or the other. You have to have both or neither. Okay, so one of those examples is in 41, which is ungrammatical, and that shows that agreement and genitive go together obligatorily. So you can't have, you actually need the genitive there. It's obligatory if you have the agreement. And then this example, which I failed to put in the handout, shows you that the reverse is not possible. Okay, so you can't genitive mark the subject and then have no agreement on the head noun. So the absence of subject agreement, it means the absence of case in these constructions. And that doesn't crucially result from the presence or absence of a nominal thing, right? Relative clauses are nominal no matter what. It's not about the presence or absence of little n. It can't be, okay? So that's the wrong generalization. The right generalization, I think, is that genitive case is not at all about the presence of a little n. It's about the presence of the right kind of D, the kind that does agreement, and the kind that selects for little np, and the kind that happens to assign genitive. Okay, so it has all this cluster of properties. Now, how are the two theories that I described to you going to account for these data? Well, looking at first at head licensing, it's actually, that's the easy path, right? So you encode, you say there are different kinds of Ds and they have different encodings. Some of them select for little np, some of them select directly for ASP, that's the adjunct one. And based on your selectional properties, you will assign different cases, okay? In addition to that, we have to say that if you're in the rightmost scenario where you're assigning genitive, you're also going to move the thing you assign genitive to, because that thing has to be the highest, that thing has to be in the left periphery. Whereas if you're assigning nominative, you can do nothing, or you can raise another topic, some other topical argument to that position, and that's how we get the scrambling cases we've been looking at. What about case by configurational assignment? Well, that's a lot harder. So in this kind of framework, the case is assigned by configuration of DPs in the same locality domain. Lexical case assigned by sisterhood. Dependent case, accusative for us, is assigned in the co-presence of a distinct unmarked DP in the relevant domain. And then unmarked case, you're going to assign if no case has been assigned already. So the genitive and the nominative are both unmarked cases in this sense. And Morantz and Baker, in discussions of similar patterns, have already basically copped to saying you have to stipulate that the category, the categorical domain in which you're assigning the case matters, because yeah, inside DPs it's different than it is inside TPs. And so for Uzbek, we could sort of build on that and say you get nominative and VP and genitive and DP. Okay, and that's what the tree in 42 basically fleshes out. However, this is not sufficient, because the D that selects for little np is the only one that licenses genitive, right? So it's not enough to just say, like, inside DPs you get genitive, because you don't always, right? That's what we see in the adjunct clauses. So it's the featural specification of D that has to matter, not just its category. So now we reach a point of convergence. Whether one proceeds according to the head licensing or the configurational approach, one will need to refer to the featural specifications of functional heads to get the distribution of nominative versus genitive correct. Of course, differences between the two approaches remain. Okay, it's not as if we've just totally collapsed them. Assignment of dependent case, that is accusative or ergative, is still going to be radically different in these approaches, and the expectations about agreement will also differ. So let's actually turn now to agreement. Agreement is dealt with quite differently in these two theories. So in the head licensing approach, as I mentioned earlier, when you do case licensing, you also do agreement with the thing you've targeted for case. So they're done simultaneously via one syntactic sort of dependency, which we call agree. And agreement in the configurational approach actually targets nominals according to a cross-linguistic case hierarchy. So it presupposes that case has been assigned, and then it looks for things to assign case to. Okay. And that hierarchy is specified in 43. So you might prefer to, the universal preference seems to be agree with the unmarked case, then possibly there are some languages that do both unmarked and dependent case, right? So when agreement targets nominals, it takes case assignment into account in this kind of theory. What Uzbek shows us is that in certain configuration, case assignment and agreement can be divorced from each other. So even though you need featural specification, it's not the case that you always target the same thing for case and agreement. So the same nominal is not always doing both things. And that goes against the head licensing view. So let's look now at case and agreement in copular non-finite clauses. The copular part is important because that's the environment where this effect shows up exclusively. We have in 44 and 45 equative copular clauses with two DPs. So these are things like I am a teacher, right? Or in 45 and 44, because I want pronouns, you have to imagine a context like a play where the participants are playing each other and can say things like I am you and you are me, right? So let's look at 44. These are clausal complements of the verb say, okay? And 44a is the expected case, so you genitive mark the thing you agree with. Sizning zamira ekan leging yizne item. Fine. 44b is the maybe unexpected case. So we have now switched the two DPs around in order, and zamira is the one bearing the genitive. Okay? So that's the one we expect agreement with, because it's the one that's case licensed. It's the one that's case marked. But instead we get zamiraning siz ekan leging yizne item. Okay, so that's the emergence of a person hierarchy effect, where you prefer to agree with the second person over the third person, regardless of the order of the thing. It doesn't matter what the order of the two DPs is. And you see the same thing in 45, but for first person over second person preference. Okay. So under the right conditions, the agreed with nominal and the genitive mark nominal are not the same nominal. That's what the B examples show. And head licensing here is, of course, going to fail because what's violated is the expectation that case and agreement features on a functional head target the same nominal. Now, configurational systems get this for free if they permit probes to be relativized to subsets of person features. So you have to be able to encode the hierarchical preference for first over second. Everybody has to do that somehow. But if you get that part right, then nothing about the configurational system prevents you from doing it. Okay. So let's try to implement it and see what happens. We need two sets of assumptions, or we need to kind of establish two things. One is you have to be able to say something about the D preferring to agree with first person over second over third, however that's encoded. And the second thing is we need to get the syntax of copular clauses at least somewhat right in order to understand why this happens only in copular clauses but not in other transitive clauses. Okay, so let's look at the copular clauses part first. The person hierarchy effect emerges only in those cases and not in transitive clauses, where agreement is always with the subject. So of the two DPs in a non-finite transitive clause, only the subject is ever accessible to the D probe. Why is that? Well, first of all, the subject is closer. It asymmetrically C-commands the object. But second, I have to claim, in fact, that there is a phase head which prevents the probe from looking further into. So there's some hard constraint that says don't look past little VP, don't look further in case there's a first-person object, which you would prefer, right? So don't keep looking. Just agree with the first thing you find, even if that's not the most preferred thing. For copular clauses, the story has to be different, right? So what I'm saying here is that copular clause structures are small clauses, and I left that intentionally underspecified because actually we don't know a lot about how copular clauses work in this language. But crucially, what I have to say is that there's no such boundary. There's no phase boundary. So you can access both DPs and look at them both and say, which one do I prefer according to my person hierarchy? And you can't do that in transitive clauses. That's a basic idea. And that's sketched for you in 46 versus 47. So in 47, what you see is that the little v is the thing, which is a kind of phonologically defective copula. And that thing takes as a complement something whose identity I am not committing myself to, but is basically a small clause. We can put this together with a theory of relativized agreement probes on the next page. So following some recent work by Behar and Kanemuyapur, I'm going to use a actually fairly simplified based on compared to what they say, but I'm just going to say what makes you first or second person versus third is that you're a participant. That's what part is. And what makes you first person versus second is you're a speaker. And Uzbek D says, my ideal target is an argument that bears both part and speaker. I'm both a participant and a speaker, right? So then I'll be first person. So in the simplest case, D is going to look for a first-person argument and find it, and everything will be great. Okay? What happens when there's no first person to be found? Right? We don't always have first persons in our discourse. That's what the tree shows you in 48. So that's a case where the two nominals are a third person and a second person. So the idea in Behar and Kandemurpur and work that preceded them is that if you don't find the thing you're looking for, you can simplify the probe in a structured way. So your preferred option is to have both speaker and participant, and if you can't do that, you're just going to have participant. So you're going to target the second person over the third person. And if both of your DPs are third person, well, then you do default agreement, or you just deal with it and agree with one of the third persons, either way. Right? So what are the theoretical consequences now? Well, for configurational theories, we don't require any changes. Both genitive and nominative are unmarked for the purposes of that theory and can be targeted for agreement in Uzbek. If the two DPs are accessible to the probing head and in the same locality domain, it should, in theory, be able to target either one for agreement. Okay, so we don't have to say anything additional. We just don't get the case facts right on that story completely, right? Now, head licensing can be adjusted, I think, to get this right. It doesn't get this right sort of on the face of it, but it can be adjusted to get this right. What you need is two separate feature sets on the D head, one that marks case and one that does 5-feature valuation, and they need to be able to target separate nominals. So they just do their work independently of each other. You break up that requirement that the relation be symmetric at all times. It's just always with the same nominal. So that's what you see in 49. There's a two-step derivation. So the first part in A just says, well, I'm a D head and I'm going to assign the genitive, and then I'm going to move the thing I've assigned genitive to, right, to my specifier position. And I'm not worrying about agreement for the moment. But in 49b, now I want to target something for agreement, and I'm going to look for something preferably with a speaker and a participant. But if I can't find something with the speaker and the participant, I'll be satisfied by something that just has the participant feature. So we're going to target the second person for agreement. Okay. It doesn't actually have to come in that order. The two operations are sort of independent of each other, I think. I just showed them in this way. Okay. So let me now sum up. When I sketched these two theories to you initially, I said neither one of them captures the Uzbek fact sort of on its face. So we're going to have to make some changes, right? The head licensing view does really well on genitive marking, but it undergenerates in copular clause environments. So it doesn't predict that we're going to get the agreement patterns we see in copular clauses. The configurational assignment does really well in the copular. It predicts the agreement facts in principle, right? If you add a couple of assumptions here and there that one might need anyway. But it overgenerates with genitive assignment. So it leads you to expect genitive where you don't get it, namely in adjunct clauses. So what emerges actually is like a hybrid set of commitments akin to what you saw in the derivation in 49. So assignment of unmarked case, either genitive or nominative, by agree with a featurely specified head, which can either assign genitive or be incapable of assigning genitive if it's the kind that participates in adjunct structures. And the second commitment is that agree may target a separate nominal under the right circumstances. So you do one relation for case assignment, you do another relation for agreement, and very often on the surface it's going to look like that's the same relation. But in fact, when you look at particular types of environments, that comes apart, namely the copular clause environment. So there remain, of course, points of comparison for the two theories, so it's not like we've just collapsed them and solved it all, right? Assignment of dependent case is one such point. So it's really quite different on those two approaches. So I want to make two final points before we stop. One is I've left subject marking, differential subject marking in the background here. But of course, this is a differential subject marking pattern. So part of the reason I've done that is because the semantic effect of the differential subject marking is fairly bleached, and I don't know what to do with that, and I'm not a semantic field worker, and if I were, I would go look more at that. One wants to know, like, what is it about the genitive marking plus the higher structural configuration that's leading to this effect? And there's a nice parallel with the differential object marking, right? Those are also marked, although they're marked accusative, and they're also higher structurally. So that seems like a real pattern that's emerging from the data that we might want to say something about. And I want to make a final note, which is that I've left this aside, but there is a good deal of variation with respect to genitive, even among regional variants of Uzbek. And certainly, there are salient differences between the patterns presented here and those we see in neighboring Turkic languages. So it's a huge opportunity to do micro-comparative syntactic research of the kind that Sabine did earlier today, in fact. And so if you're a graduate student looking for a topic, I suggest you look at this topic because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, not a lot of exploration, and a lot of interesting questions. Thank you.